In 1968, America introduced a new kind of train. Conceived by one of America's largest defense contractors at the time, and developed by the company that invented the helicopter, the UAC turbotrain would bring aircraft technology to trains, and it was to be America's response to Japan's bullet train. Powered by gas turbine engines straight out of utility aircraft, the turbotrain reached a top speed of over 170 miles per hour in testing, a world record for gas turbine-driven trains that still stands to this day. And along with suspension that allowed the entire train to lean into corners like a motorcycle, it could do away with the biggest problem that had plagued the construction of Japan's Shinkansen: the cost to build an entirely new rail line and the accompanying overhead power lines. This technological marvel should have been the revival of an America interconnected by rail, and it should have put America back in the forefront of transportation technology. With financial backing from the US government through the High-Speed Ground Transportation Act of 1965, and with other countries like Canada showing interest in the program, this should have been a success. But while other countries around the world joined the race for the fastest high-speed rail system, the one country that would fail to implement the technology was the United States.
This is the United Aircraft Turbotrain, a new dimension in travel, born of the space age, based on the technology of flight, capable of speeds greater than 170 miles per hour.
The post-war era saw many nations experience massive growth in economic prosperity and population size. Japan in particular was the prime example of incredible post-war recovery, in part thanks to assistance from the United States. But Japan was quickly approaching a problem: how to move an ever-growing population efficiently, and with that, spur more economic growth. Japan's solution came in 1964 with the introduction of the Shinkansen, a high-speed train with an operating speed of 130 miles per hour, built to run on its very own rail line. Running between Japan's two largest cities, Tokyo and Osaka, it cut travel times in half, and it proved to be enormously profitable, moving over 100 million passengers in its first 3 years of service. But the creation of the bullet train was not a smooth journey. Development was plagued with cost overruns, ultimately costing twice as much as the original estimate. And the program received so much backlash during construction that the president of Japanese National Railways and his chief engineer resigned before the project was complete. The project's issues and eventual success did not go unnoticed by the United States. And so, in fear of falling behind as a technological leader and to capitalize on the benefits of high-speed rail, America set its sights on a rivaling design. The UAC turbotrain became a technological marvel out of necessity. To avoid the issues that initially plagued Japan's bullet train project, namely the expensive overhead lines and the near perfectly straight dedicated high-speed tracks, the US wanted a train that could operate on its existing railway network. So UAC put its experience building aircraft into the turbotrain. It would receive turboprop engines out of utility aircraft, giving it the power to reach 170 miles per hour, a world record for gas turbine-powered trains that has only been beaten by experimental trains that never saw commercial service. To make the train handle the tight turns of America's antiquated East Coast railways, the turbotrain rail cars were constructed similarly to aircraft fuselages out of aluminum, and featured lower roofs than conventional rail trains to drop the center of gravity. The turbotrain was also fitted with articulated single-axle bogies with an A-frame construction from which the rail cars were suspended, allowing the cars to lean like a motorcycle. All this meant the turbotrain could round turns up to 40% faster than conventional trains, and in theory it would have significantly cut travel times on the northeastern corridor, where it was set to run. But it never did. Building bleeding-edge technology often leads to problems in development. In Canada, the trains were supposed to enter service in 1967, but technical issues delayed deliveries by 2 years. Even by the time it entered commercial service, it still experienced issues such as its braking systems freezing in winter. Reliability was such an issue initially that the trains were removed from service in Canada entirely in 1971 to be rebuilt with different car configurations and modify the gearbox and pendular suspension. But even with these modifications, the trains never delivered on their promises. The turbotrain was intended to reach a regular service speed of 120 miles per hour. Not bad. But in the US, it never operated at more than 100 miles per hour, and in Canada, it reached an average of just 85. The problem in both cases came from the very track designs the train was supposed to overcome. In both countries, trains were constantly speed limited due to thousands of level crossings, a problem Japan's bullet train avoided by having its dedicated rail line being designed to be uninterrupted. Another benefit Japan's bullet train reaped from having its own rail line was no traffic. With the rail line only allowing high-speed trains, Japan's Shinkansen keeps its delays below 1 minute on average, and does the 515-kilometer, 320-mile trip in 2 hours 21 minutes. In the US, however, the rail network was anything but uninterrupted. With the exception of a few lines in the Northeastern Corridor that Amtrak owns, most rail lines are owned by the 4 major freight rail companies. In fact, on the US map of all the rail networks, this is all that Amtrak owns. Legally speaking, this isn't actually the problem. There is a law, I have it linked down in the description below, which states that Amtrak has priority over freight rail even on the rail lines owned by the freight rail companies. So why then is passenger rail so slow and inconsistent compared to that of other nations, Japan in particular? There are 2 problems, and the first one is with that law about freight rail. Despite the fact that legally passenger rail has priority on rail lines, meaning that freight trains are required to move onto a siding to let a faster passenger train pass, this happens only rarely. Part of the reason is of course the control the freight rail companies have from owning most of the rail lines in the US. As Amtrak cannot control when a freight train is dispatched, passenger rail routinely gets stuck behind irregularly scheduled freight rail. But the issues run deeper than that. Prior to the 1900s, freight rail was the only option to move freight over land. And while trucks came about in the early 1900s, because of infrastructure limitations, trucks were mostly used for local deliveries. But as road networks grew, particularly in the 1950s, the trucking industry grew with it. Because of the increased flexibility that trucking offered, and with relatively low costs aided by subsidies, freight rail consolidated their lines heavily as an increasing number of trucks took to the road. This decision makes even more sense when looking at one of the key metrics studied by freight rail companies, gross tonnage per train, effectively the amount of money that can be made per train. In order to increase this metric, freight rail had to force consolidation by closing down available tracks to force more goods on each train. So, to clarify the order of chicken and egg here, freight rail got its first real competition in the form of the trucking industry as it came about in the early to mid 1900s. This forced freight rail to reevaluate what freight, where, and how it could compete with the trucking industry, if at all. The freight rail industry chose not to compete with trucking and settled on effectively hub-to-node transportation, where its ability to add freight with little marginal cost allowed it to lower the costs to levels that the trucking industry simply could not compete with. Hence why the US went from looking like this to this. The obvious downside for passenger rail, of course, is that there are simply less railways to choose from, less serviceable cities, but also less options to avoid freight trains. But another problem is emerging, which is that freight trains are becoming too long for their own infrastructure. Specifically in the case of letting passenger rail past, freight trains have become so long that they often cannot fit onto the sidings of their own tracks, which leaves the faster passenger trains stuck behind the freight trains. So even if freight rail companies complied with the law, which Amtrak states on their own website that they often don't, it now isn't even possible for passenger rail to pass. Japan avoided these problems by building all new dedicated rail lines for their high-speed trains. No slower passenger rail, no freight trains, no level crossings. In effect, high-speed rail got the same principal design elements of the interstate highway system here in America. A dedicated, no interruptions, high-speed thoroughfare. This is what allows Japan's Shinkansen, France's TGV, and other high-speed rail lines to reliably travel at high speeds. Unfortunately for the UAC turbotrain and America's present-day regular and high-speed passenger rail, the lack of a dedicated rail line will always keep a train, no matter how capable, from reliably traveling quickly between destinations. So is high-speed rail even worth pursuing in America? Yes, because fundamentally the US is the same as every country on Earth, even those with high-speed rail. If we overlay a map of Japan and its high-speed rail network to scale over the eastern US, you can maybe see where I'm going with this. High-speed rail could work in the US, but we need to be intentional about where it is implemented. A common remark about why trains aren't common in the US is because the US is simply too big. And in some sense that is absolutely true. Making an east to west long distance rail line from New York to Los Angeles is not sustainable. Over such a long distance, flying is simply too appealing because of the time savings. But over a shorter distance, specifically city to city travel, this is where high-speed rail is objectively the best option. Properly designed, a high-speed train can easily average over 150 miles per hour over the entire journey. This makes it several times faster than a car, and when accounting for commuting times between the city and its airport, check-in, security, and taxiing, trains can be faster than flying even over a distance of several hundred miles. Outside of the Northeast Corridor, where Amtrak sees the most usage, there are many stretches of the US that could sustain high-speed rail tracks. Amtrak has identified several stretches of rail, even without a high-speed train, that could sustain regular service today. Pueblo through Colorado Springs, Denver, Boulder, and up to Fort Collins can work today. San Luis Obispo to San Jose can work today. Los Angeles to Las Vegas can work today. Phoenix to Tucson can work today. Chicago to Louisville, Chicago to Green Bay, and Atlanta to Nashville can all work today. These are stretches that already have the rail infrastructure and the populations to sustain a regular service. Getting these stretches functioning reliably will be the first step in the right direction. The problem currently is that passenger rail routinely gets delayed because of slower freight trains, and every bad experience can turn a skeptical first-time user into a vocal advocate for spending more money on widening highways. By the way, the most obvious best way to lessen traffic is to get more drivers off of the road and into a more convenient transportation option. If adding an extra lane actually helped with traffic, then the Katy Freeway through Houston and the 401 through Toronto wouldn't look like this all the time. Just something to consider. If passenger rail had dedicated rail lines, and crucially high-speed rail lines, the UAC turbotrain would have been a success, and today's Acela by Amtrak would have the consistency to match that of Japan's, China's, and Europe's high-speed rail. But until we take that first step of giving passenger rail the priority it legally has on the tracks, we probably won't see it.